So speaking of hosting and radio and all that jazz, this is a really special episode because I don't have just one guest, I have two guests. Lisa and Chris, welcome so much to the show. I'm so glad to have you today.
Oh, it's our
Thank you.
pleasure. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, absolutely. I know we're going to talk about a lot of things. Before we really dive in, and I'll pivot to ladies first. So Lisa, you can take us away first, unless you have something planned. But I would love to know, how did you both get started collaborating, working together, and forming a program, a company?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I'll start and Chris can fill in any of the blanks here. Chris and I used to work together actually a very long time ago as partners engineering and products at a startup. And we came back together to start the company because we really wanted to share everything we'd learned from, I think, our combined 40 years of building products at like different levels, different industries, different size companies, right? So that people that are still in their earlier stages of their journey don't have to make the same mistakes that we saw time and time again, right? And then I think like we've both seen and had this experience, both like with clients and also, working in products, that having this like strong product mindset really early on increases your chances of success. Right. And that's just to think about ensuring that what we're doing is aligning with our customers' needs while also, building a product that works for the business. Right. And having that mindset really helps align the founder's vision, right, with the product right at the beginning. And then we can continue to build on that foundation, right, going forward. We've seen teams like spend so much time and like kind of spin their wheels trying to figure out things the hard way, right? And going back and having to do rework. And so we work with them to help them move faster. We make them better decisions, right? And then build products with real momentum right from the start. So that was kind of our vision.
Yeah, I mean, it's been my experience with my years of engineering management is this the more you can kind of tie your engineering group into the whys and the outcomes of like what product's trying to provide, the smoother that the entire development process goes. A lot of companies tend to like skip those, especially early on because they're trying to go for speed, but they don't realize that they're like doing a real big burst of energy out of the beginning, and then they're going to just run out of steam really quickly because the product isn't like leading the vision, right? If there's no current to pull your engineering team along and motivate them. And so, the engineers get like really excited early on about like new technology and building something new. But then, like, when they have to dig in and start doing the hard bits, they need that. Look, we're doing this because, it's going to provide a great user experience, or we're doing this because it's going to help us leapfrog into this other industry or something like that, is what they need to really connect with. Right. And that's where like the motivation comes from and all that kind of good stuff.
It sounds like, from what you both said, it's very easy to fall into the trap of maybe getting excited about the tech, the product itself, and the creative aspect, and you lose sight of the actual outcome, or maybe it's the needs and requirement of the sponsor, the client, whomever that product is for. Is that accurate, would you say?
Like I said, we just see it. We have a term for it, the feature factory, right? To where the engineering team is just executing like one ticket after another, and there's no real rhyme or reason. And you always get the same feedback. Hey, we feel like the leadership is chasing the shiny object. We're not sticking with anything long enough to see an outcome. Like, how come we're just cycling, right? And so like there's like either that comes from like a lack of connection from what engineering is doing, and leadership needs to be like retrained and being like, hey, like, you guys need to slow down. You guys need to commit to your ideas. We need to do better testing before we like shift course. Or it's like the other direction where like we're not taking the time from a leadership perspective to explain to the engineering team the outcomes that we're seeking so that they can participate in that conversation. And so they're just left with doing what they're told versus being able to join that chorus and understand what we're doing and why we're pivoting.
So it sounds like there needs to be on one side, a lot of buy-in with your team. Otherwise, they're not gonna take that ownership and it will become robotic, for lack of a better word. And then on the other side, leadership, we've talked about this. I've talked about this with so many guests before, but it's that idea of expectations, perhaps, if I'm read correctly, and the understanding that we need to set the correct expectations for what that outcome is. Otherwise, we might get lost in the weeds of the output and we've got our heads down, we're working on the project, but we forget to look up and remember the context, the why that you mentioned. Is that kind of along the same lines of what you've seen most regularly, frequently?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like really, really common for us to get caught up in a lot of the buzzwords today. Like me and Lisa talk a lot about like empowered teams, but like there's not a strong definition of what that means. And a lot of people just use it as a way to skirt that conversation, right? It's like, oh, like of course we want our teams empowered, right? But like what does that mean? What does that look like to you? What is the cost of having that? Empowered teams are great, but like they're not always the solution.
I love that you call that out, and it's almost any kind of word definition. We'll hop on that trending word or phrase or what have you, and we forget to define it. So, what is an empowered team? What does that mean to you? What does that mean for all of us?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it takes kind of like both sides of the coin to work, right? Like the leadership is very much in control of kind of like creating the environment that the team exists in. Um, and like the kinds of things that we look for out of leadership to empower their teams is like clear goals, right? Like, I mean, I can't believe how many conversations I've had with businesses that just don't have a clear set of goals of like what they're trying to achieve, and like you kind of talk to them, they're like, well, we're trying to make money, we're a business. And it's like, yeah, like I get that, but like making money as a business is a byproduct of doing what you're doing well, right? It's like not something you should necessarily pursue directly. Getting into those conversations with the leadership and like talking them through like what is the nuancing of that? Like how do you plan on making money, right? Like asking those follow-up questions. Lisa's amazing at this part. Asking all those follow-up questions about like, how do you plan on making money? What are you trying to hope for an outcome? Like what is your upper boundaries? What is your market size? What is your market vector? Like all these kinds of questions and getting like a real strategy put together provides so much downstream clarity that it creates a better environment, right? And once you kind of get those goals and priorities kind of in place, you can start developing guardrails, right, for your teams. Like these are the boundaries of what we want you guys to operate in. We don't want you to like feel like you have the whole world as an option, right? This is what we're trying to do. These are the important bits to that. And then, here's the boundaries. We don't want you guys off exploring way over here, right? And so like setting up that environment and having those clear kind of like informational pieces for the teams become very important, right? And being kind of like you know, a middle manager for quite a bit of my career, like it's important in that position to then like be able to turn around to the team and say like, okay, guys, like here's our parameters, right? Like how are we going to achieve these goals? Like how are we going to achieve these outcomes? How are we going to handle these priorities, right? Like this is the boundaries of our project, and then now they've got a space that they can work in, right? They can say like, well, maybe we can do this, or maybe this is a good trade off, and it really brings the conversation around to where they feel like they can contribute, right? And there's like a clear space that they're contributing in, and they're allowed to be experts in what they're experts in without having to try to boil the ocean, if that kind of makes sense.
Absolutely. It makes me the phrase I like to use a lot, "You can't create in chaos." And if you don't give them those guardrails, that structure, like you're saying, then they're gonna people, all of us, we're just free to wander, meander wherever our interests or our focus take us, or that shiny object syndrome. And so it sort of sounds to me, from the way you're talking about it, it's striking that balance between the guardrails that are established, the parameters of knowing this is the structure that we play in, and then you are free to play within that. So because you have that structure, now you know what you have to work with, and you can stay super focused and aligned with whatever that outcome is you're looking for because you have that ability to really zero in on what's important. So I wanted to to highlight that because I love that idea so much, and it helps give an answer to some of the folks that are like, "Well, I have all these guidelines, and yet I'm told to be empowered or take ownership, and why? Why can't I just decide what my priorities are?"
Yes. We have like two things that, speaking of chaos, as you were mentioning, right? We say that autonomy without alignment is chaos, right? And alignment without autonomy is bureaucracy, right? I'm sure we've all operated in those spaces before. And I would say, just to add, the one other thing when we talk about like having that alignment with your like goals, your North Star, right? And having those constraints, right? The other thing when we're thinking about having that empowered, like autonomous team is having those tight feedback loops, right? So that the team can always self correct before we go too far off course. So incorporating our learnings, what are we hearing from customers? How is like the business doing? Because, we can make all the projections and stuff that we want, but, things happen, right? And we need to be able to be flexible enough to adapt to those and kind of learn as we're going along, again, within those constraints and aligned with that North Star.
I love that you mentioned feedback loops, Lisa. It's really important to get that feedback. I know from just from a project management point of view, when you're developing a product, no matter whether you're operating more traditionally or agilely, you want to make sure that you're continuously improving. And when it comes to people, sometimes that can be even harder because we might not be open or ready to receive that feedback, or we might not be adept at giving that feedback to other people either. So, how do you coach businesses or individuals through that feedback process? And what are some of your practical tips for getting that feedback?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. The When we think about like when specifically around like customer feedback and user feedback, but I mean this can apply broadly, is we always want to start with like what are our goals here, right? Like we can collect all of the data in the world. We can ask all of the questions that we want, right? We can send out the surveys, we can have the one-to-ones. But like what are we trying to learn? Right? Like what decisions are we hoping to inform with this information that we're taking in? What types of assumptions do we have that we're testing, right? And so we need to make sure we set out those parameters, right, as goals before, we're just collecting, data broadly, asking a bunch of questions. I love a user interview as much as the next person, but we need to know, like, why are we here and what are we talking to so we can really dig in with the person. Because often as humans, as you know, right, like we aren't very great at describing the actual problem, right? That we might be having. We describe a lot of things that are going around, what's happening, the symptoms, but we're very great at like describing things. So you need to have great conversations aligned with like, what are we trying to discover here? And then we need to make sure that we are analyzing that in line with what people try to tell you, right? Like, oh, the button needs to be blue, or, this is like the problem that I'm having during the day. We need to analyze that, like, what's the reasoning behind that? Like, why? Right? I had worked with an old coworker and she used to say, like, so what? Who cares? Right? Right. We get the data in, right? But it's true. Like, okay, and so what? Like, who cares? Like, what are we doing with that? What does that tell us, right? Underneath of the words, right? And then we need to take it, we need to make it actionable. We need to like, do something with it, right? Whether that's into back to leadership in terms of informing strategy, maybe it's into a roadmap, into your teams, right? The people that you work with. So we're all better informed about the problems we're trying to solve and the users that we're like solving them for and our customers and what they need, and make sure that we're disseminating that information, like sharing it out. Like I used to do like a Friday, especially on like big projects that had a lot of like new learnings, and just send out emails, right? Here's like the key things we learned from like talking to people this week, right? And so that it's not just siloed to my team and my department, but everybody gets to benefit from that knowledge. We get to see what's working and what's not working.
That's a great idea. That's very cross-functional, in your approach because you're including the whole company. It's not simply one department in a vacuum, secluded away with your learning, but you're opening up that for sharing.
Oh, for sure. And then like sales might come back and say like, "Well, really? What did they say about that? And like, can you tell me a little bit more? Because I haven't heard that before." Or I interpreted that piece of feedback or learning in a totally different way. Can we chat about this? Right. And so it also kind of helps further that theme of like alignment right across. So we're all like speaking the same language because we all have our biases and ways that we think, about things. And it turns out we're just like talking past each other, even though we're saying the same words. Yeah.
Yeah.
Not that I've ever had that, obviously.
No, no, not being in products, surely. Right.
Surely, it's never occurred.
Or
No.
any kind of leadership at all.
Yes, exactly, exactly.
I just love that. I'm actually thinking, okay, how can I use that with my work that I'm doing now? Because it can be so hard to align people just on the feedback and the terminology and the words that we're using. And to your point earlier, I like to say the onion is larger than you think because it can be a lot of layers that you have to peel back to get to the actual root cause of a problem that you have. And in my experience, I found that a lot of times it's because we're speaking a different language. And, one person is saying, well, this is generic, but the other person is hearing it and they're defining what that means differently. And so being able to communicate better is so important regardless of the work that you're doing. It often comes down to communication, I think.
I mean, like, especially like being like an engineering head in the past, like having that information is really what helps us like prioritize too. I mean, engineering teams are constantly trying to find ways to do things like cheaper or like do the right things that are going to create like the most impactful outcome. But oftentimes we're left without that kind of information, that user feedback kind of like level information when we're trying to make those decisions. And instead we're like looking at 2 feature requests. You know what I mean? And so like having that data at the decision making point, like what should we be investing in? Like what goals should we be chasing? Like what priorities should we have is like monumental. And I think like skipping it 90% of the time is the wrong choice, right? Because then you're just basically relying on what your engineering team thinks, right? Because they're like left up to grooming the backlog and that kind of stuff. And I found that like that's one of the most powerful tools, right? Is getting that alignment out of your upper management, like making sure that they're all reading the same kind of like not just the same report, but they're like interpreting that report correctly or like in the same way. Is like one of the biggest speed boosts we have from an engineering team perspective because now things aren't shifting constantly. We're not trying things down at the engineering level. We're able to try those ideas at a higher level that's much less cost.
You're making me realize too, Chris, it's about the collaboration between leadership and the rest of the team, whatever roles they might have, whether it is that specialist role or otherwise. How do you foster better collaboration within a company when maybe you have some of those key managers like you're talking about who they're not doing the work, but they're overseeing it and they need to be involved. And to me, it's like striking a balance between being a micromanager and being that leader who's helping to guide and knowing when to step back and knowing to when to roll up your sleeves. How do you strike that balance or find that sort of harmony between the two?
Yeah, I mean, I've coached quite a few people that have like come out of kind of like the doer role and up into like more of a manager role. And a lot of people like I've run into like a handful of different like what does manager mean companies, right? In some of the places that I've worked, it's been like a people manager, right? Um, but I would say for the most part, when it comes to like an engineering manager, they still need you like neck deep in the product, right? Like, but it's not like hands deep in the code, right? Where you think like an engineering resource would go. Where they really need the help is, higher up. They need help at the leadership roles, right? And so like my job, like, in the past when I was an engineering manager was more about that cross-functional, like going to product, making sure that product is bringing us the information that we need, building up kind of like that, I call it contracts and APIs, but like the way that we work with each other and building those pipelines, right? Because like teams are really good at like the insular process, right? Like they're really great at like improving themselves. They're really good at improving what they're doing in the product that they're on. but they struggle when the problems come from outside, right? Like they don't feel like they can move those those blocks, I guess. And or doing so becomes like this weird, like they're stepping outside the boundaries of their roles, right? And so I think that's like where managers can really come in and help is they can help build those bridges, right? And so like that's kind of like how me and Lisa like really got hooked up working together was I realized how good of a resource she was. I realized how much the alignment kind of like between her and I was like driving our team. And I just kinda took that step up, and I was like, "Okay, like, I'm here for you as, like, a full-time resource, like, let's figure these things out together. Let's be honest about what I'm willing to take in and take to the team and let them figure out versus, like, what we need to figure out from a leadership perspective. Like, these goals aren't clear, the priorities aren't clear, the alignment isn't there. Like, I can't take this to my team. You're asking them to build, a cloud castle, right? Like, it's getting that engineering kind of, like, preview up high enough to where we're not at the precipice of asking, "Can we build it?" Right? It's, "Should we build it?" It's, "What should we build?" And, like, engineering kind of being present and being able to say, like, "Look, this isn't super feasible," or, like, "The tech's there, but, like, that's not really how it works," or, like, "Sure, we can build that, but we need, like, $1,000,000 budget," right? Like, something like that.
Not oh, or unrealistic. And that sounds like that's where the discernment comes in too that we need to have as leaders, going back to those guardrails that you were mentioning earlier, Chris. It's not only that we put up guardrails for our team to know the structure to work within, but we need to protect them from any kind of project that will steer them off course unintentionally too. And if we're not clear, and you were saying this earlier, but if we're not clear as leaders on what we're all working together, then we kind of become like what I think of as college professors in my mind of everybody's class is the most important. And we get all the homework from every professor, like it's the only class you ever have. And so that's where it's really important for leadership to be aligned, but then also how are you protecting your team from distractions or from projects that aren't maybe going to have that impact that you're looking for. So I wanted to highlight that point. Lisa, what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, completely agree. I mean, again, not that I've ever been in a situation where there's competing priorities and a complete lack of alignment. But it is so important to have that and be able to like explain the why, right? Of course, of like what we're doing, what outcome we're trying to achieve, both for like, the person, like we build software, right? So like we're building it for someone to do something with it, right? And it has to, be feasible within the constraints of our business. Um, but the other thing I always like to ask when I'm dealing with other stakeholders that have perhaps competing priorities is the what problem are we trying to solve here question. Because it's so natural. We all do this. I do this. It's like it come with like these like solutions. Like I have the greatest idea. You know what we're gonna do, right? Um, but it's like, well, what problem are you trying to solve? Which allows you to like wind it back and then align that with whatever kind of like strategic goals we're trying to like accomplish this year, this quarter, whatever, right? And see whether it fits in that or not. And it allows us to, again, kind of like force the conversation back to us getting on the same page from the leadership perspective before like bringing that down to our teams and saying, like, oh, well, do you mind, like, is this going to impact any work? Like, da da da. When in fact, perhaps the, sensible idea is that we defer that to next quarter, right? And we can all as leaders agree to do that and then we keep everybody focused on executing on what we have planned to hit those goals instead of they're always just within reach, but we never quite get there, right? Because we're trying to do all the homework at the same time, right? As you said.
It's like constant negotiation, whether it's negotiating the trade-offs or, how are we handling resources within our constraints. Yeah, it makes me or politically within our team, how are we um, socially or politically handling the personalities and the different dynamics of the group too. There's a lot to juggle there.
If I could add one more thing onto that, the other, I think, it really great thing that's worked, tremendously for me is understanding that while sometimes we, as leaders we have conflicting priorities, right? It's important to really kind of have some empathy for and understanding of the incentives behind what each person is trying to accomplish, right? Like you might have somebody that's trying to hit their quota, right? Because like that's how they get paid, right? Or you might have somebody that has like incentivized in some other ways. And so trying to come to those conversations with like a little bit of empathy and really like that curious mindset of like trying to understand puts you in that better position to like do the negotiation that you just mentioned, right?
Yeah, and to follow along with that, like, you were kind of mentioning earlier, like, big it's a big job for, like, the managers to kind of, like, keep their teams, like, compartmentalized in some way to where, like, they're distraction free, but, like, a big job, from a good manager is really about creating a contact point, right? Like, not in and of themselves, but how do I reach out to the engineering, group? How do I reach out to the product group? How do I reach out to the marketing group? But it's like not only that, but like setting up those expectations. Like this is what engineering cares about. Like this is what product cares about, right? And that real clear definition of role or like who owns what, right? Like one of the big red flags that I see these days is like what I call the every resource, right? And it's like anybody can do any job within a company, and it's like sure you could, but you did hire experts for the roles that you hired for. And so, like, to where there's, like, some flexibility that can be built into any role, and that's great. I think that it's also important for, people to remember that, like, not every person fits in every slot, right? And that's important. I think part of being empowered is knowing that you're being leveraged for your expertise, right? Like, the constant being asked to work outside your box is exhausting for most people.
Wow, that's a really great reminder. I see that a lot, especially with marketing, because so many people want their marketing manager to be the videographer and the editor and the social media manager and the digital marketer and you make a really impactful statement there. We can't always work without outside our box. And a lot of people I've experienced that where you see folks who really need that extra structure of what am I supposed to be doing and what do I need to be doing and what are my priorities, and they need that guidance from us. So I'm glad you highlight that especially. What do you do though? This is actually a good segue into the next question. What do you do when you have some of those high performers who are hungry to do more and want to contribute more, and you still want to keep them focused and help them advance in whatever that role might be for them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that people that are, like, just knocking their, role out of the park, I think, like, it's okay to leave them in their lane. There should always be upward mobility for people that are like developing expertise. I think in the case of like what happens is a lot of people kind of like work to their upper boundary and then they start kind of like sniffing around for larger responsibility as like they feel like they can start operating outside their box. I think that those people are wonderful employees. They're the ones that are going to help train the people that are coming up behind them, right? Because they've got all that passion and excitement for what they do, but not only that, but they're the ones that can travel across, functional boundaries really well. A lot of times those people are great to task with like just picking up a little bit of information from this group and a little bit of the information from this group and bringing it back to their group, right? And that's really like the good kind of like first step. A lot of times, you know, um, is letting them get a taste of where they might wanna be looking next, right? But not only that, but learning how to go gather that information from other people and bringing it back and presenting it to the team is like the first step to leadership, right? It establishes them as like a higher level expert, but not only that, but it teaches them how to, experience, ingest, and then report, right? And I think that's something that like a lot of people just don't get the chance to try to do very often. Um, I know that like a lot of the companies that I've been management with, I've always had some kind of like cross functional or cross pollination kind of policy to where I've done everything from we had like one day a month where we got the different kind of like groups together and we did kind of like cross functional training. We talked about like what we were doing, what we care about, what we're struggling with, and it was a great way to kind of like learn about your other kind of like silos within a company. And, it makes it a lot easier for them to communicate, right? To talk to each other, just open up Slack and start a conversation and be like, "Hey, I heard that you guys were struggling with XYZ, right? I think I've got an idea in there. If you've got 5 minutes, I'd love to like pass it along to you. And it's kind of like that cross pollination, that the natural cross pollination that you really want. Like you don't ever really want to like force that, right? Because that's where you're like, oh, you're pushing people outside of their roles and they're not feeling comfortable. But you've got to create those pathways, right? They don't come naturally. Not even not even in the smallest company have I ever seen them become natural.
Yeah, I mean, agreed. And I think from a leader perspective, right, as a manager, as a leader, I think it's important to kind of shift from the management hat, right, as we would say, and put on your coach hat, right? And so with that, right, comes a lot more listening, right? Asking questions like, well, instead of telling, how would you think about like approaching this? Or what do you think about that? Or like, what were your like takeaways from that like meeting, project, whatever? Right. And starting to ask them of those questions, or they have some idea they want to run with. Like, great. Like, what do you think about that? What do you think the risks are? Like, how would you think about like mitigating those? And so you coaching them through asking questions, right? And you're kind of turn the table so you're like the co-pilot, right? They're like in the driver's seat there. And I think that can be hard for some leaders because, some of us are overachievers and type A, and we want to make sure everything is like, we got here, because we have been like executing and doing things really well. And we want to make sure everything stays like on track and nobody fails and everything is going really well. But it's important to kind of let that go. And you have to create the environment for people to feel safe to try new things, right? And it's like as a leader, I feel like it's your responsibility to provide, like as Chris said, like create some of those opportunities, right, for your people. And then also stand behind them, right? Right. Like if we're giving them the flexibility and the autonomy to go out there and do something new, we have to like understand that like they might stumble, right? I've stumbled, we've all stumbled, right? And a manager has to have their back and be there to support them in that kind of coaching way and help them, like, you know, correct back if there's like a little bit of a misstep and understanding that, like, for most of us, we're not like saving babies, right? Like, it's okay, right? I might not like it, but at the end of the day, it's okay. And that experience of somebody, I mean, my biggest learnings have been through where I've failed because those have been my biggest, most profound learning experiences, right? As I grew into being a leader. And I think that everybody should be afforded that opportunity. And I had some really great leaders that allowed me the space to do that and also the support to help me, right, move on from that.
That is such an important message, Lisa, and, that was the topic of my conversation with an earlier guest, Nicole Perry, and we were talking about the point of view of academics and, the creative environment. And so I wonder too, hearkening back to that one and our conversation now, how much of that idea of needing to be perfect and acing every exam early in our development has translated over into the work space and our culture of needing to be perfect and ace every product deliverable and making sure that we're crossing our T's and dotting our I's, and so we bring that into the next environment and the next environment. And to your point, and from our earlier conversation too, it's our job as leaders to create that space where people can fail, whatever that might be, whether it's a mere lesson learned or, we're in charge of something and maybe it doesn't go the way that we had hoped. How do we create that space where it's safe to fail? And I feel like, and I'm curious what you all think on how to set up that space, but I feel like leaders, it's very scary for us because to your earlier point, we want our teams to do great, and there's a lot of pressure on us. And I take it to mean that we have to be giving enough distance for the person to take ownership over their project, but still close enough that we can jump in before it becomes emergency level so that there is some kind of, we'll get back to what you're saying, Chris, guardrails, some kind of boundary within so that we're not jeopardizing an entire company, or jeopardizing an entire team within the company, that we have those boundaries in place for that individual to practice and experiment and test. So, long-winded kind of build up to how do we do that? What do we do to make that space?
I think a lot of it has to do with the people are interacting with the people close to them, right? Like, those are usually the flags that I look for is, is somebody, like, kind of, like, rabbit holing? Like, are they just, like, working really, really hard on, like, one problem? Usually that's, like, a red flag, right? Like, usually when we see somebody that's, like, working through a problem, like, in a healthy way, they're, like, collaborating, right? Like, they're asking their peers, they're pinging me with, like, questions, like, those kinds of things. I mean, I think it's, like, more of, like, an engineering problem than anything, but, like, there's so much excitement usually when, like, a coder gets involved that, like, their first instinct is to just start hammering out a solution, right? And that means for them, that means going to their code and, like, writing up some stuff, like, getting some ideas, right? And it's not until, like, much later they're, like, seeking feedback, right? And something that, like, I try to coach them along with is just, like, don't take don't jump 4 stairs at a time, right? Like, go ahead and take your time when it's new, right? So start by writing down some ideas onto a paper and shop it around, right? See what people say, see what people do, see how people react. And then, like, as you gain confidence, take your next step. Like, maybe, come up with some mocks, right? And then, like, then take the next step, like do a demo, like do a prototype or something. But constantly be seeking that feedback, right? And if you can connect them to that constant sense of, like, gaining feedback, then, like, that stress of, like, collaboration goes away, right? Because it becomes normal. Um, I think that that's, like, one of, like, the key ways that you, like, help somebody that might be struggling with, um, getting through that, uh, sorry, I'm at a loss for words. It's a key way to help people get over that hump, right? And I think that that's the major hump is it's like, "Oh, I don't wanna get feedback because, they're gonna tear my idea apart." It's like, "Well, good." Right? It means, like, you were barking up the wrong tree, and we discovered it on day 2 instead of day 200, right? Um, and so I think that, there's a lot of, like, coaching that goes into that. Like Lisa says, like, when you try to, I think people try to manage their way out of problems, and management is, like, a lot of, like, affecting policy and things like that versus, like, coaching, which is where you, like, sit down with the individual and you try to build a plan. Like, they're gonna do something new, they're gonna do something scary, right? Like, something they're not comfortable with, something that's bigger than their normal, workload, like something that, touches more points than they ever touched in, like, the business. To get them over that hurdle, you have to build confidence. Building confidence comes with a plan, right? And, like, that kind of stuff, like, really, really helps unlocks people. I think on the other side of that coin, I think, managers tend to have a reactionary, kind of bit to them to where they wanna take an idea and immediately throw it in front of the team, right? And there's, like, not enough processing on the management side to where, like, there's risk evaluation and expectation setting and those kinds of things, right? Like, it's very important as a manager to be honest with, your higher ups about, like, "Hey, look, we'll do this, right? But your guys' timeline is tight, and I've only got people that have never worked with this technology before. So the risk is out of the park, right? But, like, we'll commit to it, like, and we'll do what we can." But, like, it sets up the right idea to be like, okay, like, let's start talking about, like, the iron triangle, right? Like, it can be fast, it could be cost effective, or it can be, well built, right? And so setting up that kind of, like, conversation with them, like, and not allowing them to just railroad their idea through is, like, what really creates the room from the outside. Right? Like, they totally understand that, like, we're doing this, that it's new, that the timeline's in danger from the get-go, and then it's the constant feedback loop, like we were talking about earlier, to where you're updating them with real updates that say, like, "Look, timeline's slipping, we think it's, like, 2 weeks," or, like, "Hey, things are easier than we thought they were, they're going well." Like, whatever it may be, being that honest source of information about what's going on with your team is what really creates that room, right? And then in turn, if they come down and they said, like, "Chris, this has got to get out," like, it's got to hit this date because we're going to go announce the feature at this conference and we can't move that timeline. Then it turns into the opposite conversation. You go back to the team and you say, like, "Look, here's the boundaries. They're changing, right? Like, what can we do?" in that mentality. And I think that that's where like the real harm comes in is when there's never a conversation. It's just this is the deadline, and like you've just got to run at it, and like you can't be honest about what can get done, what isn't going to get done. You can't be honest about the quality of what's going to get done. You can't have that honest conversation. That's where everything breaks down, right? And then somebody just gets it in their head that they're the one that has to make this work, and all of a sudden they've worked 7 80-hour weeks back to back or something like that, right?
I feel like there are a lot of folks talking about this idea too of how do you set someone up to take on challenges and take risk. And I've seen less conversation. Maybe this is just my algorithm feeding me the first half of it, but I see less about the second potential half of, well, you failed, now what? And how do we address that with a team member? And or, if I failed, what do we do about it? Right? Because we could establish those guardrails, we could coach. Chris, I hear the understanding that we don't wanna throw someone in to start swimming on their own without giving them a life jacket and a rowboat, right, to make their way. We need to set them up for that success. But things are gonna inevitably, change, or there might be those external conditions that they can't control in the VUCA world of, volatility and complexity that we live in. We know that they're going to be met with some challenges that might actually produce a quote unquote failure, or at least that lesson that we have to learn. So, again, long winded, but thinking through and just talking through, if I'm then on the other side of it and I've got a team member who has made a mistake, or maybe they've made a decision that wasn't the best decision in hindsight, how do you coach them through that to rebuild the confidence when they're feeling maybe absolutely, earth shattered or gutted because they just now feel like they're stuck in a rut?
Yeah. I mean, I think we've all been there, right? And like that's part of the coaching is to normalize, right, this a little bit, right? That like it's okay. None of us are quote perfect or however we want to define that all of the time. And it is inside of the missteps, failures, whatever you want to call them, that we have the ability to learn and grow, right? So like first and foremost, like to share, when people are feeling, I know I can get particularly sensitive, right? I'm sure we all can, right? If you're like, oh my gosh, like, so embarrassed or whatever the feelings might be. And sharing again, like person saying, like, be honest, be vulnerable, right? And share experiences from yourself to help normalize, right? And I have plenty of experiences to draw from that are generally much worse. So that's, a great way to kind of like disarm and like, it's okay. And then we want to make sure that we ask questions, right? We want to ask, like, well, what do you think happened? And, what did you learn from this? Or why did you think that this, where do you think it went off course? And it's like not focusing on the individual, any their like potential shortcomings or whatever, like who didn't really like, whatever. It's like, well, perhaps like we didn't interpret the data correctly, or we missed asking a question, or perhaps like going back to my earlier point about how we're sometimes talking by each other, perhaps like there was some miscommunication or misalignment, or we thought we knew the goals, but we didn't, right? The direction was unclear, right? And we want to kind of work through that with them, both, on the process side of things, right? Normalizing, and it's okay. It's not something to fear. I think there's kind of two parts to there. Like there's that we can make that kind of safety, right, within your team as a leader. You have, control over that, right? It's your team, you're shaping that actively, like the culture of your team. Then you have usually you're part of a larger organization, whatever size and shape that might be. That might not be the culture, right, of the organization. And I also think that just to add that it's the leader's responsibility, I think, also to continue to try to push that culture that they're cultivating within their team into the broader organization, like almost evangelizing. It's effective, I think, to say things like 100% predictability is 0% innovation. That really resonates with a lot of business leaders, right? And like that's and so like to then humanize the like, oh well, we do want people to experiment and we do want to try things. And we do understand that that like might not work 100% of the time, but like that's okay. And so you have to kind of create that safe space inside your team, but also push to help the broader organization if that's not already a culture that we have in place.
I think it's important to understand that, like, in a leadership role, you're gonna have public facing actions and private facing actions, right? And like when addressing failure with a team, right? Like the public facing actor is like a management role, right? Like it's somebody there to like talk through the policy and the procedure of what they're going through, right? And so the conversation shouldn't be focused on any one person's actions in that conversation. It should be, how did the system that we're following, even if it boils down to, somebody made a mistake, right? I think it's important to have that conversation and be like, could this mistake been avoided? Like, what could have we done? Like, how can we affect or improve the policy? Right? And really the outside bubble cares about those responses, right? They wanna know, like, how are you not gonna, like, have this happen again, right? And an answer that's like, "Well, Jim can never touch front end again," is, like, not a solution, you know what I mean? And, like, so, like, the answers are rarely like, "We need to fire Jim," right? The answer outward should be like, we need some training here. We need some better policies around this. Like, we're investigating how, Jim got put on this assignment alone when it should have really been like a two-person job. Like, it's like that kind of stuff. But there's a secondary role that you have as a leader, which is like you got to like take your management hat off and stop dealing with the larger business and put your coaching hat on and deal with the individual. And it's unfortunate that sometimes problems come down to individual performance, but that's not a public action. That's never a public action, right? Like, it should be something that you pull the person in privately, and that the communication isn't blame. It's about, again, like, it's about providing a plan, right? "Hey, man, like, what really happened here? Like, how can we avoid this in the future? Like, do you need more support? Do you need some training? Like, the door's closed. Let's talk about it," right? So, businesses are rarely human, right? Like, they very rarely care about the human at the end of the day. And, it's important to represent your team within that system, but I think that it's also important as a leader to deal with the human, right, at the end of the day. And, dealing with them is not like yelling at them. It's not telling them they're wrong. They already know that, right? Like Lisa said, they already know what happened and they already feel bad about it. Really it's just about letting them get that emotion out and then making them feel supported, right? Like, look, like, we're all gonna make mistakes. We learned what we learned from this, right? Let's get you a plan so we make sure it doesn't happen again. Let's make sure that your confidence is still there. Because that's the worst, right? Like, you don't ever want your employee to lose confidence.
Yeah, that then it just pulls the whole team and company down if that's how you're approaching every situation. I love it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
that's
mean,
really
like, people find out, right?
yeah, they do. It's a great reminder for all of us at the end of the day, for both of from what you each said, the understand that we're talking to humans and we're approaching humans. And then the other part of it that you were alluding to as well, so that it comes back to us as leaders and how have we set up our team from the beginning. And you both touched on both aspects of that. So I think really good reminder as we take our next steps, whatever they might be in leadership, that we're dealing with and helping people, and it's not about managing robots. So please, everyone, take care of your people. With that said, Chris, Lisa, it sounds like you're taking wonderful care of the people and the clients that you work with. So, how can we get in touch? How can people learn a little bit more about you? Where would you like them to find you online?
Yeah, the best resource, for us is our website, bereadysteady.com, and, there you'll find more information about us. You'll find some case studies of some of the work that we've done in the past. You'll find our blog articles, and then you'll find a way to get a hold of us. Either you can schedule a meeting right with us on our website, or, you can reach out to us through email or whatnot. We also have a Discord if you wanna come hang out with us anytime. All of that you can find it on the website.
I'll definitely hang out with you all anytime. This was wonderful. At least any last thoughts from you 2?
No, I would just say if like this like team empowerment is something that you're like, this sounds interesting, but like how do we go about, doing some of this? We put together like a little guide, right? For most people that are like in a team, and managing a team adjacent, individual contributor, whatever. It's on our website. You can download it. It's a little free guidebook, and it has some like helpful like tips, suggestions, scenarios on things like you could do to try to move forward, that agenda and have a little bit more, I don't know, flexibility and autonomy and, feel great about your work at the end of the day.
I love that. Thank you all so much for providing that. We'll have the link below. So, listeners, check out that practical guide. I know I'm going to be going there myself. I always love new and helpful tips. And thank you both so much, Lisa, Chris. It's been an absolute pleasure. We could talk for hours, but I think we'll probably just have you back for another episode because I'm sure there's more we can chat about. But please, let's keep the conversation online. Listeners, thank you all for tuning in. Let us know your thoughts and your feedback on the next, and we'll see you the next time. Bye, everybody.